and welcome everybody. It's great to see so many people on this webinar with us today. Can everybody hear me loud and clear? I hope so. You should see that there's a little chat window at the bottom right of your web page. If you want to send any questions through as we're going along, please do. We'll have space to answer your questions at the end. But as Suzanne said, we've got a lot of information to go through, so let's get cracking. So first, what we want to do is look at some of the overall growth trends in the Ross Case survey, because this is now the 10th year of results that we have. We thought it would be interesting to look back and look at 10-year change and compare it to a couple of other sectors. So if you're looking at the table here, the top is UK higher education. So 380 million reported in new funds in the first Ross Case survey in 2004 to 5 that we have results for. That has now gone up in the most recent one to nearly £861 million. Overall growth of that in that period of 127%. And if you do a compound annual growth rate, which effectively smooths out the bumps over that 10-year period, it comes in at 9.5% a year. So how does that compare? Well, first, looking at the bottom, at the UK charity sector, you'll see, obviously, the numbers are much, much bigger, 36.6 billion in 2003 to 4, growing to 43.8 billion in 2013 to 14. But the growth is much flatter. Over that period, only overall growth of 20%, compound annual growth of 2%. I've got a report saying no sound from somebody. Has anybody else experiencing no sound? And then education in the US, 25.6 billion in 2004 to 5, growing to 40.3 billion in FY14 to 15. So that's overall growth of 57% and compound annual growth of 5%. So what that shows is actually UK higher education is growing at a very healthy rate compared both to the UK charity sector and the overall education sector in the US. As might be expected from programs in startup phase, they're growing very healthily, very nicely. So the survey findings overall, we can see here, the total amount of philanthropic income has increased by 8% from the previous year to 861 million. Total cash income has increased by 14%. So that's very healthy, with legacies bringing in 95.6 million from 980 legacy donors, and individuals and organisations contributing 53% and 47% towards the cash income respectively. And investment in fundraising has increased by 10.5%, and alumni relations investment by 7%. And lastly, when we're comparing figures for 3 years across 106 institutions, 55 institutions have secured more than £1 million in total cash income in the last year, which is a 15% increase from 2012 to 13. So we'll just look at those results graphically again, and you can see here the charity sector overall in the UK, 2% compound annual growth over the last 10 years, higher education in the US, 5%, and higher education in the UK, 9.5%. Very, very, very encouraging. Now, one of the things we have access to at GG+A is the Voluntary Supported Education Survey for the US, which is an incredibly rich survey that now goes back over more than 40 years worth of results. And so just to put some context on this, here is the VSE survey figures going back all the way to 1972 from 2012. These are, and you can see here, it's a pretty steep growth curve, particularly after the mid-1980s. Now, UK higher education fundraising comes in round about here at the 1982 mark at the moment. Our 861 million is roughly there. But look at the total giving to top 10 public higher education institutions. The compound annual growth rate there of 10% bodes very, very well for UK universities. So if focus and investment is maintained, it very much looks as if we could be on track to maintain that same kind of growth level over the next 10, 20, 30 years. So that means in 10 years' time, we could be over 2 billion, in 20 years' time, over 5 billion, and in 30 years' time, over 13 billion philanthropic income for universities, which is very, very exciting. One of the other things that you can see from this graph very nicely is that the bumps and spikes largely correspond to recessionary pressures. So you can see one just after 99-2000, and you can see another big one after 2008-2009. But look, in all cases, at the recovery, which shows the resilience of higher education to recession fundraising, to recessionary shocks, which is, again, a very, very encouraging thing to see. So moving on for a moment, what is driving the growth in higher education fundraising right now? So we know, and it is an elephant in the room, that Oxford and Cambridge do take a very large proportion of the funds donated to UK higher education, but it's not all Oxbridge driven. Although Oxbridge accounts for 44% of new funds and cash, and actually that proportion is going down. It was 51% in 2006-7. Actually, over 10 years, the compound annual growth rates, when you exclude Oxbridge, are somewhat higher than when they're in, than overall. And looking at the survey results for this year, 51 institutions in the survey, so that's about half, account for 96% of the new funds and cash. So what distinguishes them? So the first has to be leadership and financial commitment to advancement, extraordinary leadership. So the mean investment in advancement in the survey is 0.4% of institutional expenditure. So to put that another way, that's less than half a pence for every pound that's spent institutionally. But when you look at the clusters, and we're going to look at those in a bit, you'll see that the elite institutions are investing much more than that, nearly 2% of institutional expenditure, and they're seeing an extraordinary return as a result. There are big ideas and big gifts, and this is the continuing growth in UK higher education campaigns. They're effectively engaging donors in large-scale investments of £1 million plus. There's a dramatic increase in professional staff and budget support for advancement, and all of this adds up to a developing institutional culture of philanthropy. So to break that down a little bit, what does that mean? Well, the key drivers of a culture of philanthropy that we've seen over the last 50 years at GG+A, over the last 20 years plus in the UK. First is that extraordinary leadership and commitment to invest from institutional leaders. There has to be leadership drive to invest and to say, we are going to dedicate a certain proportion of our institutional expenditure to this. Startup funding is very, very important. If a program isn't capitalized effectively at the beginning, it's very unlikely to make enough headway in the first few years to succeed. Moving on from that is one of the big challenges that a number of our clients report to us, but is really essential to driving growth, and that culture of philanthropy, engagement of deans, program directors, and selected academic partners in the fundraising process. Really important to embed philanthropy into the culture of institutions. And also an integrated approach to alumni relations, annual giving, and major gifts. All three are necessary, and institutions need to be able to recognize the long-term value of activity that isn't immediately income generating. Alongside that, is extraordinary stewardship. It's one thing to acquire donors, but it's another thing altogether to keep those as repeat donors, and it's much more effective if you do. Major donors almost never give their full amounts that they could possibly give as their first gifts. So many major donors test out institutions with smaller gifts to see what level of stewardship they're going to receive, to see how much they can trust an institution before they will commit to that very big gift. And it applies down the ladder as well to annual fund donors as well. And lastly, social proof, because once major donors are in place and can be then can share their experiences with prospective donors who may be their colleagues and friends who share a commitment to that institution, that really kickstarts growth in the major gift side of fundraising programs. So that's the overview. And so what I'm going to do now is hand over to my colleague Laurie Hirsch, who is going to dive into the clusters, which we think are really, really fascinating element of the Ross Case Survey.
Thanks, Adrian. Hi, everybody. Happy to be here talking to you from Canada. And really interesting looking at what's happening in the UK. As Suzanne mentioned, you know, I started my career really in Canada and have worked with GG+A since 1997 and in the UK. And the patterns that I'm seeing in higher ed growth in the UK are very similar to what we experienced in Canada about 20 years ago. And, you know, a key issue that led to an increased focus of investment and trying to change the culture of philanthropy really was government cutbacks in higher education, which we see in the UK, and then the implications internally for those institutions in terms of program framework, budgetary investments, and strategies. So in looking at the Ross Case Survey, I think it'd be really interesting for all of us to step back and look at it by the cluster type. And really the great growth that we're seeing that Adrian showcased and the survey showcased in UK higher ed, let's get underneath the waterline of the iceberg, right? The money raised really tells one story, but let's go underneath that waterline and see, okay, where is that money coming from? What are the implications for future growth for each of your programs? And so some of the slides and data I want to talk about really is really the metric, the key marker of the percentage of monies coming from individuals and organizations. And in the survey, there are two key dimensions of that the survey is looking at. One is cash income received each year and new funds secured. And I'm going to get into that at the initial part of my talk here. And just to step back a bit, let's talk about what those two dimensions are. New funds secured, are the new funds secured in the previous fiscal year, right? It's really the productivity of your fundraising program in a particular year. It's not looking at cash that's come in from previous pledges that are booked. Okay, so when we're talking new funds secure, this figure reflects the success of the current fundraising activity of the program. Income is income received in a year includes all cash which arrived during that particular year, whether it's from new single cash gifts or from previous payments against pledges secure. So it's the cumulative impact of your fundraising program over time. And why we look at individuals compared to organizations is what we see in nascent development programs. There is an over-reliance on the development program to rely on organizational entities to provide money to the institution. That's just natural, right? You're going to get more money in the early stages from foundations, trusts, corporations than you will from the broader individual cohort, because a lot of work had not yet been done on engaging the particularly alumni prospect pool, the alumni constituency in a concerted way. So it's not on the slide here, but in the report basically said new funds overall in the Case Raw survey last year, 64% comes in from organizations, while new funds come from individuals, new funds. But over time, we're seeing a good cumulative effect of, you see here, if you look in 2012, the cumulative effect of everybody's fundraising efforts is showing that in 2012, right here, you know, 59% of the monies came in from organizations, right? In 2015, now it's at 47%. Cash income, we are growing the sort of the equity of the individual giving base, and we are starting to see those shifts, right? Less dependent of overall on organizations and more money coming from individuals. This has a whole series of implications on stewardship. Adrian just talked about excellent stewardship, a whole series of other implications on managing prospect pools, which I'll get into. So let's look at a cluster. Does this trend take place? So what's the impact on the clusters, right? And remember, what we typically see is when we're looking at fragile, emerging, moderate, established, elite, one of the common characteristics that we see in looking at the data, right, is fragile tend to be the more nascent programs, right? I mean, established, that's why they're called established, they've been there a while. So when programs start out, they're heavily dependent upon gifts from organizations. And as I say, I will get into, okay, what does that mean for my program? But what does that mean for you today is the takeaway for you would be to go back to your program and really start to say, analyze, look at these numbers as a gauge and say, where are we at vis-a-vis when that comes from income, cumulative income that's coming into us, and also new funds that are coming in every year. And here's the new fund money, right? So new funds, again, fragile, very dependent, and as we move down, it becomes less and less dependent. So one of the things, the implications here too are what we see is organizational-based. When universities move from organizational-based fundraising to an individual-based fundraising, it's moving from a transactional approach to fundraising to a relationship-based model. And there are some key considerations when we're talking about that, and I'll get into that later on in my talk, further on in these slides. Investment is key, and staffing is key, right? And staffing does relate also eventually to the size and the type of the prospect pools. So here, when we're looking at performance by cluster, what we see is, and this just doesn't relate just to, yeah, they're raising more money, right? But this is really calculated. How much money are they raising overall relative to the number of staff at hand, right? So just, you know, fragile clusters tend to have 2 staff per cohort, emerging 6, moderate 17, established 39, and elite 292. And I think why we see so much staff in the elite 292 is because they tend to be very decentralized, right? The Oxbridge universities are very decentralized. There's an alumni relations and annual giving person in every shop. But the point of this slide really is the more money that's invested in staff over time, the more monies that are raised, it is true, and the net money just nets out across the investment. If you take out the investment made, they still are well ahead. And the fragiles are really in startup phase, so it's a loss leader at this point. And the thing in terms of building capacity and building development programs is you really do have to have somewhat of a stomach for it, right? Because it does take some initial time when the institution has invested money in the programs, and there will be pressure on where is the money coming from, where are we going to see that next big major gift? It doesn't happen overnight, right? So really having a sound understanding of what investments are required at what stage, what are the implications from a staffing, programmatic, and strategic perspective, and how do you build and develop your programs over time. So just to go back, as I would say, for all of you, I would go back to your organizations in the next week and really start to track this number and really see, you know, how have we progressed over the last 5 years? How are we shifting the stick from organizations to individuals? Again, it's not just about the money raised, right? It's about what are we doing to move and develop our programs. And it's obvious, as we said, from the high-level data, something is definitely happening here. So I'm just going to go back. So what are some of the factors that relate to cluster stage? And yes, time and money are important, but frameworks and strategies are key. And I think it's really interesting to step back, and when we really look at, having worked a lot in the UK and having worked in the US and Canada, and talking to all of my colleagues sometimes, particularly Adrian and my UK colleagues, they always say, you know, the great opportunity UK institutions have is really to learn from the past in terms of some of the issues that came up out of the US fundraising models, particularly, and I'll tell you what happened pretty much in the 60s and 70s, particularly with public, right? There's public universities and private universities. What we saw in the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s, there was a decrease in funding from governments for higher education in the U.S. Sound familiar? You know, my first client for GG+A was UCLA. UCLA used to be funded by the state of California 70%. Now it's 5%. Okay, what does that all mean for you? Well, what that means is, what we see is as budgets decrease, and they will decrease probably more in the UK too, there's pressure on the institution to raise more money. What we saw is, and this is, I'm telling you this so we won't make the same mistakes. What happened was, when that was happening several years ago, fundraising became very decentralized, because in the public universities, the deans panicked. They got into annual giving. They all started developing their own annual giving programs. They all started, many of them, doing their own alumni relations programs. There wasn't a central investment for essential development shops so much, and that's why sometimes you can walk into some big schools where everybody has their own alumni relations annual giving program. Less so now, but I've spent a lot of time untangling the annual giving side of the house. So to Adrian's point, an integrated alumni relations annual giving program at the beginning of our programs is really, really key, and having a core, strong, central programming that can service the whole university. So how we structure things today, we really have in the UK a golden opportunity to learn from the Americans and the Canadians too, and from our own internal learnings, and there's a lot of good sharing going on, I know, all the time, is sort of how to structure programs and continue to build the programs as they evolve and emerge over time. So time as a factor, right? And I got into that a bit, right? And Case, this is directly from the survey, obviously. So 4 of the 5 fragile institutions started their development and alumni relations programming after 2005, right? And interesting enough, right, you could see that the established ones, all barring one, started in their development and alumni relations programs before 2005. Right? Why is that key? Is because time is a factor, right? So what we have to figure out how we address is, when the Vice Chancellor of the university, the Board of Trustees, gives us lump sum money of £1 million to invest in fundraising, unfortunately, it doesn't happen overnight, right? No major gift prospect goes from 0 to £100,000 overnight, but strategically, we can figure out internally how we can show some win-win stories. The next slide gets into the, when 22 institutions, but 22 institutions where programs began before 2000, still in emerging or moderate clusters. So here, time, as I said, really is a factor. So budget, it does take money to make money. I'll just go back to my Canadian experience because I bring that up because I too used to always look across the border and say, I remember I went to a Case Spring Institute, Summer Institute at Dartmouth, and they had a huge org chart, 176 staff, raising millions of dollars, and there was I at little old McGill University, great university, but a small development shop, maybe 15 people, raising maybe 10 million pounds a year. And we thought, we'll never be like that. Don't show us those big org charts. That's not us. And then lo and behold, we used to always brag at McGill, well, we're raising, it cost us 5 cents on the dollar to raise money. And I used to always joke and say that was like saying, hey, we feed our kids on 20 pounds a week. What happened is we had a very charismatic university president came in, tripled our budget. Now that university is raising about 80 million pounds a year. So I tell you that story because don't think that that won't happen to you. It will over time with the right budget, investments, and leadership. And here we can see, right, you can just clearly see staffing investments, you know, it just follows right down the line in terms of the structures. And then you can see here on the far right, right, total funds raised as a percentage of institutional expenditures, right, 11%, 0.5%, 1.9, 3.6. So you can see more money invested, more money raised. And then also too, right, money invested, it's great to have staff, but you need program money, programmatic budget money, right? And depending on where you are in that phase of development, you would say, well, what kind of program money do you need? And that is hard to get, right? But there's a scope and scale thing. You don't have to build these huge programs overnight. You just have to do each program component well. So between a fragile and emerging here, I mean, what you really, yes, you want to be focusing on a few core top donors to start to show, you know, that yes, we can raise money. Like as Adrian said, there's social proof and then there's internal proof of concept to the institution. But alumni relations and annual giving program programming is really, really key, right? Obviously, as we're moving from moderate to established and we're raising more money, you know, in this kind of space here, you really need to start to think about, okay, excellent stewardship. I mean, you're thinking about all of that along the way, but you're starting to develop programs around donor engagement and stewardships, programs around leadership annual giving circles to build the major gift pipeline. Communication programs, yes, you're always doing communication, but these programs are taking more structure, and hence the programmatic budget investments that we see with established universities frameworks are investing more in tools such as prospect management tools, business intelligence tools. Again, it's not that we're not doing these things along the way. They're happening sort of a bit ad hoc, ad-lib, reactive, right? But the programs then can start to become more proactive along the way in terms of framework and capacity building. And here, again, this kind of just goes at it too, right? Cost per dollar raised. The more money you're raising, the cost, the university will get their money back, right? The investments pay off over time. And so that's why these types of comparative numbers are really, really helpful in terms of making the internal case for support. The best internal case is really tripling or doubling the amount of dollars over the last X amount of years, and that will happen if you place your investments in the right way. I wanted to show this slide, and again, I would look at this internally. I think this is a good way to take the pulse on your programs. So we could see, okay, X amount, these universities all raising a certain amount from cash income from organizations, but then it's the percentage of money from this cohort that they are dependent upon from the largest cash gift. Right? And what does that tell me when I see it going down? It says they are less dependent on just a few donors. They have a broader, more developed prospect pool, particularly individually based prospect pool, right? And so they have a more robust fundraising operation. So how do we develop that? Let's talk about this. So when we're shifting from dependence on a singular donor and income from organization, it has implications for overall programming, structure, strategic and strategies and growth. So when you move from a transactional to a relationship-based model, training is really key, because when you're raising money from organizations, or grants, foundation grants, we're really going by their internal deadlines as opposed to developing relationships over time. We know with GG+A, it's the building of long-term relationships over time is really key. And then in terms of, major gift solicitation is most often a process, never a single event. I remember seeing some really interesting data from UCLA, a large public institution, for their billion-dollar, well, not billion-dollar, one of their large campaigns that closed in early 2000s. When they looked at their million-dollar donors, alumni donors, like 80% of them had been giving to the annual fund for 16 years or more. Right? So, and we know that is a driver. So very important, which is why Adrian and I are always happy to raise the annual giving flag. But again, strong annual giving programs are propelled by strong foundations of alumni relations programming. So personal engagement with the institution is really, really key. Again, I talked about moving from transactional to relationship-based fundraising. There are training implications. There's even the way the data shows up on the database, so you need to consider that. How is the data from my prospect management process? And then, let's see, shallow and underdeveloped prospect pools, that's a big challenge. What happens is you're gonna get a lot of money, but if you have a nascent prospect pool, what do? How do you develop it? A lot of institutions who haven't had time to focus on prospect pools are using LinkedIn as a source of data to find. We just did that at Concordia. We found 20,000 alumni we did not have using LinkedIn data, and we were using business intelligence tools to see who are vice presidents, who are presidents, and how do we look at capacity in terms of where they're living. I've talked a lot about alumni relations, the importance of that. Annual giving can do discovery calls. Don't overlook the fact that asking for an annual gift is a way of building inclination and a culture of philanthropy, and need for innovative strategies to accelerate growth. And then I'm just going to finish here and then soon turn it over to Andy. I'll give you an example of what I've done at my day job, where we're going into campaign. We only have 600 major gift prospects. We need 3,000. What we know is we cannot qualify 5,000 prospects one person at a time. So I've created a program there. I call it APE, Accelerated Prospect Engagement, where we're using alumni relations strategies and annual giving strategies and data mining tools to move a cohort of prospects closer to the university using those mass tools and then feeding them off to the major gift fundraisers. So there's a lot to talk about and a lot to do. I'm delighted to be here with you and to continue the conversation. Congratulations to everybody on how far you've come, and lots of good stuff to go. I'll turn it over to Andy, who can talk so much about alumni relations and why it's so important.
Thank you very much, Lori, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm going to use the last few minutes of our time together today to look at a couple of specific aspects of alumni engagement as an advancement strategy and how this relates back to the fundraising data that are shared in the Ross Case survey. And the survey itself, obviously, is very heavily focused on fundraising outcomes, and the data regarding alumni relations in the survey is really about inputs to advancement, not about outcomes per se. So how can this report inform alumni relations strategy? First, I have only one chart, and it's the last one that you're going to see from us today, and it shows in pounds spent 2 metrics. The very short blue columns in this chart represent financial outlay by each cohort's institutions in advancement overall. And as you see, there's a very slight increase from left to right, and in the last pair of cohorts, a larger increase as you move across, starting with fragile up to the elite institutions. And what this shows is that the more established programs are spending more on advancement per contactable alumnus of their university. And the second metric displayed in this chart are the taller gray columns, and they show the cost per donor obtained. And this is for all kinds of donors, including alumni donors. And the lesson that I think one lesson we can extract here is pretty simple, and that is, as you invest more in advancement per alumnus, fundraising itself becomes more efficient. So there's a lot of talk about the absolute numbers and how many pounds did you raise, but what we're talking about here is fundraising efficiency. And many institutional leaders may say, if only we could control spending, it'll be really good for our budget. We'll be spending less, and that's good for the institution. And they may not spend as much on alumni relations staffing or alumni relations activities. And this logic would hold true if spending on alumni engagement was really just another expense. But as I think we've heard from Adrian and Lori, if done with long-term advancement outcomes in mind, alumni relations is not really just an expense. It's actually an investment because it has a long-term measurable return. And one way to interpret the data in this chart is that if you fall into the trap of the sort of false economy of saving money in alumni relations and fundraising, and you don't invest adequately per contactable alumnus, you become inefficient at fundraising. And as a result, you spend a tremendous amount of money in relative terms for each pound that you raise from all kinds of donors. So, as Adrian and Lori have said, in alumni relations in general, you don't usually see a short-term financial return on investment that you can correlate directly with your alumni relations expenditures. So many decision makers in institutions assume that spending on alumni outreach is risky and that it may represent a way of sort of throwing away scarce funds that could be better spent elsewhere. But in fact, investment in alumni relations has the effect of getting you off the starting line for fundraising with new donors and also for retaining existing donors and growing their commitment to the institution in the way that Lori just described. And you overcome the inertia that many advancement operations experience when you invest in the long-term aspect of the relationship. And I'll talk in a moment about some specific ways to do that. It's important to remember when you're building the relationships, you don't get that value right away. You get it over time, and the mature advancement operations, the established and the elite ones in this survey, are able to show this, but it's a long-term investment. Now, I'm going to close with a few very brief comments about alumni relations strategy in general that might be helpful as you think about this question of increased investment over time. So first, Ross Case shows an emphasis among the subject institutions in relatively short-term fundraising, as my colleagues have just described. And an increase in long-term fundraising generally requires an investment in other forms of engagement other than just soliciting donations. And we'll talk about what some of those forms of engagement are. People who don't give financially can give in other ways. They can participate in events. They can open up their professional networks to current students and to other alumni, and they can help the institution itself organize alumni gatherings and interactions. And this is what we generally call alumni engagement, the ways that alumni support alma mater other than making donations. And in this area, success doesn't mean you have to spend as much in absolute terms or hire as many people to match the numbers of a mature North American alumni office. As Lori was describing, what it means is relative increases in your efforts in this area are actually going to show results relative to what you're able to do right now. So, fundraising from individuals as opposed to organizations requires long-term ongoing investment in alumni engagement of all kinds. And eventually what this fosters is a sort of culture of alma mater, and that actually drives regular alumni giving in the future, which in turn fills the pipeline with the most consistent and most generous future donors that allows for fundraising success over time. And finally, because you can't benchmark alumni relations quantitatively as easily as you can some of the fundraising results, I'll just share a couple of thoughts in closing on things that you can track on your own. One thing you can estimate is alumni relations expenditure per alumnus. And it's very simple to do. Take your alumni relations budget, how much you spend on staff expenses and your programs, divide it by the number of contactable alumni that you have, and this tells you roughly how much you're spending per contactable alumnus. Similarly, what is the load on each alumni relations staff person? How many alumni are you really expecting, broadly speaking, them to support? And you can estimate the number of alumni per alumni relations staff position. You take the number of contactable alumni, divide it by the full-time equivalent number of staff members in alumni relations, and this gives you a ratio that, again, you can track internally over time, and that if you want, you can benchmark or compare with peer institutions to see where you fall within that spectrum. And this is just really to get you thinking in terms of measurement about ways that you can assess alumni engagement efforts over time so that you have some quantitative thought process in place. Now, I want to thank you all for being with us today. I am going to turn it back over to my colleague Suzanne for questions that you might have, and again, thank you very much. Suzanne?
Thank you so much to our presenters. And again, I want to congratulate everybody on this call on the tremendous growth you've experienced in the UK. GG+A has a number of Australian clients, and while we know that you probably get sick of hearing comparisons of your own programs to Canada and the US, you should definitely know that our Australian clients look to you all as their future and are very excited at the growth that you've seen. We would be delighted to take questions for the next few minutes, and I will kick those off with one we received earlier. And I'm hoping that both Lori and Andy will address this. Somebody wants to know what leads to the kind of internal changes that result in loosening up of the budget that we've talked a lot about today. What have you seen be effective in telling the story, first on the fundraising side, but then also the alumni relations side, which will inspire university leaders to make more money available? Lori, could you start us off?
Yep. Yeah, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, Lori, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, okay. Well, what we really see is it does start with the university leadership, and often what it starts with is the vice chancellor. What we're seeing is vice chancellors coming in, and even deans coming in with fundraising experience these days, or the need to know that to elevate their institutions, that they need to come with an attitude about raising money. And so it starts with, a big factor, doesn't always start there, is having presidential vice chancellor leadership and in working with the board of trustees to first of all launch a campaign. So it often starts with launching a campaign, and then they realize, oh, to launch a campaign we need money, we need increased budgetary investments, and then with the increased budgetary investments, what happens is if it's placed in the right way and with a few significant gifts, it starts with an individual stepping up and making those big gifts that has a sea change on the organization, and then there's a tipping point momentum that happens, and then of course the professionalization of the industry, which we've seen in the UK over time. Andy, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, thank you, Lori. I would add a couple of things. First of all, just reinforce your statement about leadership. Without recognition at the very top that investing in alumni community and the lifelong relationship, you won't really be able to affect the kind of change institutionally that you need. You know, we often say, you know, students, you're only students for maybe 3 years, but you're alumni forever. And that idea that this is a lifelong relationship has to be internalized at the institution. Secondly, I think it's important to understand that you don't need to, you know, increase your budget 5,000% overnight. It actually is a small increase that can make a measurable difference. The trick is to focus your increased budget or staff time on a specific program that has an outcome, and then measure to check to find out whether you achieved that outcome. And those small improvements in alumni engagement and the increased activity and support from alumni that they engender cumulatively add up over time to show the long-term value that we've been talking about. A couple of last points. One is, I think increasingly we recognize that alumni are able to self-organize in many ways. They have tools, apps, and access to technology that allows them to interact with each other and create organic alumni communities. They don't need alma mater in the way they used to, and they can and will do it without you. And the question is whether you want to be a participant institutionally in the life of your alumni community, or whether you're happy to let them go off and self-organize without the institution being at the table. And I think that that is seen as a risk, rightly, by many, that you will lose that connection with your alumni if you let them do everything by themselves. You want to be present as a broker and a helper to support them. What do you want them to help? What do you want them to do? What do you want to help with? The last thing I would say is we're very good at announcing things and sending out press releases and tooting our own horns when a professor wins a teaching award or a student achieves something great, or an athletic team achieves a championship. And yet we're not as good as institutions at listening. And it's important to actually not just have a one-way broadcast function for your alumni communications, but to actually especially use social media and individual interactions, for example, at events, to listen to your alumni and find out what it is they want to achieve. Much, especially among younger alumni and current students, is focused on employability and careers and professional success. And those are keys to organizing established alumni in ways that can help those who come after them, in ways that support the institution overall. So I would say, don't just announce things that you're very proud of. Stop, ask, and listen to your alumni. Will tell you what it is that they want and need, and you'll be in a position to offer programs of value.
Thank you, Andy. And I would just like to amplify one thing that Andy said, because we see it in some of our current clients. In the beginning of alumni relations, when they really didn't have the resources to keep up with their groups that wanted to organize, they ceded control completely. And once those alumni are out doing their own thing, it is very, very hard to insert the institution back in. So while we appreciate you may not have the capacity to run full-fledged alumni programs, keeping some sort of connection to your alma mater is really critical as you think about how to prioritize your time and resources.
And I have just one thing to add also, which is to amplify the point that both Laurie and Andy have made about budget investment and increase in budget investment being relative. We've deliberately not in this presentation talked very much about hard budget numbers. We've shown them as a percentage of institutional expenditure because that's something that you can all much more easily relate back to your own institutions. So you all, if you all have access to the data sharing, you'll know what your own spend on advancement is as a percentage of institutional expenditure. How close is it to that mean investment figure of 0.4%? And for the institutions that are happy enough to be in the established cohort, you know, how close are you getting to the elite institutions who are spending closer to 1.72% as a percentage of institutional investment? And then you can look at increases in budget that will be proportionate to the overall budget of your institution.
Thank you, Adrienne. We have one last question, time for one last question, and this question comes in for Laurie. Laurie, can you speak more about the APE model at Concordia?
Yeah, and actually I called it APE. We developed it there from scratch. So APE stands for Accelerated Prospect Engagement. And so, you know, Concordia is a university in Montreal that is at its nascent stages of developing fundraising capacity, and with significant budgetary investments by the institution in terms of staff and programming, going into a campaign, but as I alluded to earlier, we have about 600 major gift prospects. We need about 3,000, and that's just because they haven't had a programmatic focus on this. So the challenge is, right, you have 12 major gift fundraisers. some focused on top-level major gifts, some on lower-level major gifts, not enough prospects. And so we said, okay, well, typically what the modality is you give people 120 prospects to qualify. They go out, they're doing a lot of cold calling. Well, that takes a lot of time and effort, and sometimes it's what we want to say is, how do we accelerate that process? What tools do we have in alumni relations and annual giving to accelerate that prospect? So what we did was we took out we isolated out a cohort of about 5,000 individuals who came up with major gift capacity. That would be £10,000 or more. And what we're doing is we're saying, okay, what are the core engagement touch points? So there's a series of core engagement touch points that are designed. Those are usually mass touch points, and then customized touch points that the frontline fundraiser or even the alumni relations team will use to draw those people closer to the institution. So it's not solely dependent upon one fundraiser, and you can imagine, time-wise, you cannot qualify, to meet 5,000 people would be impossible. Right? So we're using those tools, and so some of those tools would be at the customized engagement standpoint. We say, wow, let's make sure that these people get the Vice Chancellor's Inner Circle newsletter. Let's make sure that if there's a key speaker coming to campus, a Jane Goodall, a Dalai Lama, someone really interesting, for some of them, not all of them, but we target them, we say, okay, the ones that are a capacity of $100,000 or more, they don't have strong affinity, so they typically have low to medium affinity prospects. Let's make sure they get a front of the line invitation to come to that event. So what we're doing is we're using all the tools that are there in alumni relations and annual giving and donor engagement, and we're using them tactically and proactively to move the needle. And so we've coded these prospects in the background, and we're looking for people, next generation leadership, where we're looking, okay, this person is 35 years old. We know that they're going to have capacity. Their inclination rate, their affinity is low to medium. Let's pull them into our Young Alumni Notables program. Let's get them to mentor, to speak at a career day. So we're using all of those tools, things that we were not doing, but we're doing it not just ad hoc and ad lib, but in a very, very proactive way. And if any of you would like to learn more about that, I'd be happy to share some more information about this with you. My email, my GG+A email is on screen, but I think it's a great way for you all to develop your prospect pools and accelerate that prospect engagement up to annual giving and into the major gift pipeline.
Thank you, Lori. Thank you all again. As Lori said, her email, as well as everyone else's email, is on this final slide. You can also find information about any of our speakers today on GG+A's website. We welcome additional questions, and we will make this presentation available online. Thank you so much for joining us today. We were delighted to spend the time with you this afternoon, and we look forward to hearing from any of you. Thank you so much, and thanks so much to the panelists.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.